Hello and welcome to DirectX 11 Tutorial 7. In this tutorial we are going to get into covering raw input. We are only going to use raw input for capturing raw mouse moves. Now first let's get into why we are even looking into raw input. Let's say that this drawing right here is your actual window that we are currently creating. Now your x coordinates at the top left start at 0. And at the end, they will go to your window's width. Our window is 800, so I just used 800 in this example. And your y-coordinates will start at 0 at the top left and go down to your window's height, which is 600 in our example. So if we open up our window, and let's say our initial point is in the center of the window, okay? So our initial point is at 400, 300. And if we move our mouse, let's say we move the mouse to the right, we move it over to 600, 300. Well, if we are just capturing this with mouse moves, then we will get the absolute position each time the mouse moves. So for mouse move, we might get something like 402, 300, 404, 300. Maybe we went 3 pixels in this move. All the way until we get to 600, 300. So if we are trying to make something like a first-person camera, we're not interested in the absolute change in the mouse value. We're interested in the relative change. So we would have to take the previous position and subtract it from this new position to get the relative change every single time. Another problem is when we got off the window, we wouldn't really be getting the values that we want, so we would have to constantly move the mouse back to the middle of the window. Now, if we are using raw input, we would see something like this. And this is for the same example we were just looking at, let's say. And then, I don't know, the last change might have been 2-0, but you see we're only getting the relative change here. Let's say we go over 2 pixels, we get back, okay, we went 2 pixels to the right on our X, and our Y did not change at all. And let's say we do that again, we get the same thing, and so forth. Something else that's great about raw input is if we get off the window, and let's say that, we're pushing the mouse against the side of the monitor, raw input will still capture all of the mouse movements you are doing. Alright, so let's open up our source. And the first thing we want to do is we are going to add a onMouseMoveRaw function to our mouse class. This is going to be called by the window proc whenever a raw mouse move happens. And the definition for that will just look like this. We are just pushing a new event to the event buffer for a raw mouse move. And now let's go to our window container and go look at our window proc. Alright, and we are going to start our Windows message raw input message. So let's look at the documentation for this, because this one is there's a lot more to it than the other messages we were handling. Alright, so the first thing is, you see in our W param, it tells us this means input occurred while the application was in the foreground. So in the future, we might change it to only process when it's in the foreground. But for now, we're just going to process both. That'd be very easy to change, so it's not that important. It says the application must call default window proc so the system can perform cleanup. And it says that for both situations. So before we do anything, we are going to return default window proc, just because we want to make sure that we clean up anything that needs to be cleaned up. Alright, and we see that the lparm is a handle to the raw input structure. Now, it's not a pointer, right? It's a handle. So we need a way to get that raw input data still. Down here you'll see that the lparm has a handle to the raw input structure. So to get the raw data, we can use the handle in a call to get raw input data. And then you'll see right below here it says raw input is available only when the application calls register raw input devices with valid device specifications. So before we can even look at getting raw input data, we need to register our raw input devices, which in our case is just the mouse. So let's open this up. Alright, and let's look at this function because it's a little confusing. So when we register our raw input devices, we take an array of raw input device structures, and then we take the number of devices, and then the size of the raw input device structure. So actually, that function is pretty straightforward, but the raw input device structure is where it becomes a little confusing. Let's open that up. Okay, so for the raw input device structure, we have a unsigned short called US usage page, unsigned short for US usage, a flags word, and then a handle to our window. So the unsigned short, it says it is the top level collection usage page for the raw input device. So I don't know about you all, but when I had initially read this, I did not know what this was supposed to mean. And then the same for usage, top level collection usage for the raw input device. Essentially, what we need to know is that the combination of these two unsigned shorts will tell the program which device we're talking about, whether that's the mouse or the keyboard or whatever. Alright, the next is the flag that determines how we're going to interpret that information, and it can be 0, so we are just going to use the default. We're not going to use any of these special ones. And the last flag is a handle to the window, and if null, it just follows the keyboard focus. So in that case, we are just going to pass in null. So you may be wondering, how are we supposed to know what the US usage page and what the US usage are for a mouse device? Well, I had found on a forum somebody had a link to what was supposed to be some of the usage page codes. But it looks like that page could not be found anymore. I'm not sure why. Microsoft seems to have taken it down. So I used the Wayback Machine, and I went back to 2008 when someone had taken a capture of this page, and I found some codes. So let's see what we have. For the mouse, we have a usage page of hex value 1 and the usage value of hex value 2. Alright, so let's make a window container constructor that is going to register the raw input devices. Alright, and we are going to make a static bool to determine whether raw input has been initialized, so that we only do this one time. Alright, so we create our raw input device variable. We set the usage page and usage flags for mouse. And our handle to our window is null. So I change it from 0 so it's more clear. And we're using the default flags. Then we go to register the devices. If it failed, then we're going to call our error logger. The error is, we can get that from get last error. Failed to register raw input devices. And then we're just going to exit with an exit code of -1, since we can't return anything from this constructor. So let's test this and just make sure that it is being registered. Alright, and that seems to have worked just fine. Alright, let's go back to our window proc and back to the raw input message. So we need to actually get this raw input data. So let's take a look at the get raw input data function. The first argument is the handle to our raw input, which we can get from our lparm. The next argument is the command flag. We want to get the actual data, so we are going to pass in RID input. The next argument is a pointer to the data. We don't have the actual raw data at this point, so we are going to pass in null. And since we pass in null, the next argument, which is supposed to store the size of the data in bytes, it will be populated with that size. So this is the next argument where we were just talking about. And then lastly, we have the size of our raw input header structure for the last argument. Now what this returns is it returns the number of bytes copied. If all of the bytes are successfully retrieved, then it should match the number of bytes that we had got before. But I guess you can get less. So if we get less, we are just going to discard the message. Or rather, we're just not going to process it. Also, we are getting the raw input of one raw input structure at a time. You could use get raw input buffer to get an array of them, but it's a little bit more complicated, and most of the examples I could find, I was having issues getting working, so we might get into that later, but for now, we're just going to do it the more simple way. Alright, so we create an unsigned int to store our data size. We call get raw input data, and we pass in our handle to our raw input from our lparm. We pass in RID input because we want the raw data. For the pointer to the data, we're passing in null because we need to get the size. And then here's the reference to where we want to store the data size. And then the size of the raw input header. So for this, we are only going to do the rest as long as data size is greater than 0. Because otherwise we will try to read in 0 bytes, which wouldn't make any sense. Alright, and we are going to make a unique pointer for where we are going to store these bytes. And I guess the size will be data size. Alright, so next we are going to call get raw input data again. But this time for the pointer to the data, we are getting the pointer to the unique pointer we just made. And in our if statement, we are checking that the return value of this is equal to the data size that we are expecting. So that if we get anything less than our data size, we are not going to actually process this message. Alright, if we go back to our documentation, we see that the get raw input data gets the raw input of a raw input structure. So let's pull open the raw input structure and see what we are expecting. Alright, and you see that it contains the raw input header. So let's open up the raw input header. And inside of the header, you can see the type. So we only want mouse messages. So we are going to look where the type is raw input message type mouse. So the first thing is we are going to cast the pointer that we had just filled with our data to be a raw input pointer. And next, we are going to check the type and make sure that it is a mouse data type. And then if we look at the actual data that we get back, so if it's a mouse, we will get back the raw mouse data. You will see that we have this last x and last y variables. And if we scroll down through all of this stuff, we will see the last x is a motion in the x direction, and it's relative. And the last y is a motion in the y direction, which is also relative. And this could change depending on your flags, but the way we are using it, it is relative. So if we go back into our program, this should be set up to accept raw input now. So what we want to do, just to test this, let's go into our engine CPP, and we are going to make a test right here. So if, I guess we should have, if me get type is raw input, raw input move, then let's build a string. Alright, and this should print out the coordinates down in our output. So let's see. So you see down in our output, it's printing off the relative change. So if I move my mouse to the right, you see we get +1 for our x. And I'm not moving it perfectly, so that's why it changes sometimes. And then you see our y isn't really changing. And if I just move my mouse down, our y will be +1 and our x isn't really changing. So yeah, that's working exactly how we had expected. So that is all that we are going to cover for this tutorial. In the next tutorial, we are finally going to initialize DirectX.